Hi, and welcome back to the session. Did you know that about 20% of the global population lives with a disability? And out of that 20%, 13.6% are African American or Black descent. Today we have with us Angela Hooker, who is a senior program manager at Microsoft. She will share how we can ensure that people with disabilities have a voice in these extraordinary times, and that being done through accessibility in tech. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Protest without strategy is an empty threat that will flip this system on its head.
You have to teach it in school. It has to be in the workplace. It has to be everywhere for real change. I think this is a movement that's going to change the world.
We have every right to be out here. We did not bother y'all. And we're out here peacefully for 3 days. Violence is y'all like, don't put that on us.
When someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible. Because what it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what Black people have gone through, what Black people have experienced in this country since the time the first Black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa.
I might not be able to see the results of what we're doing, but my children and their children and great-grandchildren will, and that's the point of all this.
I want to be out there. I want to participate, but I find that there's just a lack of accessibility.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm here to talk to you about that issue, about accessibility, and how people everywhere can get involved in everything. In the United States, there are over 6.5 million people who may be unable to rise up and participate in the activities that are going on right now. They, just like everyone else, need to have the ability to see the messages that we're seeing, to hear them, react to them, respond to them, sit in them. It's our duty to include everyone so that they can receive and engage with others on these issues. Often they're unable to join in these protests physically. Sometimes it's the lack of access that makes it hard for them to find messages of hope, messages of peace, messages of unity, messages of restlessness, messages of apathy, messages of fear, messages of rage, messages of hate, messages of division, messages of strife. It could be that those 6.5 million people are the key to amplifying the positive, and they may have answers for the negative. But whatever their contribution could be and should be, people with disabilities deserve to be included. So let's talk about those numbers for a second. In the United States alone, there are 47.8 million Black and African American people. As of 2019, only 19.3% of people with a disability are employed. And they are the 6.5 in that number, the 6.5 million people who are having trouble joining in the movements, in the discussions, everything that's happening right now. These are the Black and African American people who live with disabilities. The interesting thing is that with these numbers, we want to look at why they may be unable to participate. Like I said before, lack of access is an issue, but when you look at not having access to systems and information, people are unable to thrive. And that's what we want. We want to help everyone to have a voice in these conversations right now and to be able to thrive and to support each other. It really comes down to inclusion. And when we say that we want to support people with disabilities, again, it's not just offering them platitudes. It's not offering them a line. It's about including them so that they have a place at the table. We deserve to hear everyone's voice, and that's whether or not we agree with what they say. We need to come together to have these discussions so that we can understand everyone's perspective, because that's when we learn how to appreciate each other. We can bolster each other and help one another heal together. That's how we include everyone. So let's talk about the medium and the method. Since we know that Black and African American people have been disenfranchised over the years, we also know that tech is one of those areas where they can be affected, but it's also one of the most powerful means that we have to include them. People who may be unable to get out physically rely on technology in every part of their lives. It's not just about having the message, it's even about accessing the message. It comes down to the very issue of access. So whether we're talking about apps, hardware, software, websites, whatever we write, everything has to be made accessible so that people with disabilities can participate. So the interesting thing is when we start talking about accessibility and disability, we usually focus on a couple of disabilities. And as a person who is vision impaired, I can definitely say that that's probably the disability that you hear most about. But there are so many other types of disabilities that we should take into consideration. And each one of those disability types, the people in those groups have different needs for access. So I want to also say that in the interest of time, we're going to be looking at an overview of the topics I'm presenting, and I will have more details in my slides so that you can get even more information on each piece of information. So let's talk about disability types. Like I said, there's usually a focus on people who are vision impaired, But there are also people who are deaf or hard of hearing, people who are cognitively impaired, dyslexics, people who have seizure or other neurological concerns. There are people who have mental health concerns, and so on, because it continues with anxiety and depression. There are some people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. There are people who have motor disabilities, people on the autism spectrum, the elderly and the aging, people who may not have a disability, but they do have access needs. And in that, I would include the elderly and the aging, and people who have low language proficiency or who may be non-native language speakers. There are also situational limitations. It could be someone is using an outdated device, or they may be in a noisy room, so they may not be able to hear a video. People could be outside while they're on their mobile devices and the sun is streaming down, so they can't really see their screen very well. So each of those situations and disability types have needs. And again, in the interest of time, I can't present them all, but I invite you to look at the resources that I'm sharing about these issues. So let's get more into the process when it comes to supporting accessibility in our messages and our technologies. We usually hear about accessibility being an engineering issue, and people look to developers to really take the lead when it comes to making things accessible. But I want to say that the responsibility for accessibility doesn't rest on their shoulders. It's beneficial to everyone if everyone on your team is involved in creating accessible work. And so I like to call that role-based accessibility, because everyone has something that they can do in their processes and their everyday work to ensure that people have access. So let's start out with PMs, and whether we're talking about program managers, product managers, project managers, the roles are pretty similar. And it's actually with this group of people that ensuring access begins, because they are setting the pace for accessibility in every project. So we want to look at what they can do to start the ball rolling when it comes to accessibility. So usually I've seen people start with accessibility at the very end of their projects, but that's a problem because it leads to making a project that's covered with duct tape, because you've got to patch this and patch that and fix this and fix that later on. So before you even start working on your project, you want to realize that you need to include accessibility and bring in an accessibility consultant to work with you and your team, especially if you're new to the topic. This person can advise you on issues like accessibility standards and laws, processes that you should use, technologies, and this person is here to help you realize what's realistic to accomplish. And they can also advise you on the specifics of what people with disabilities need to access your information. So when it comes to PMing a project, there are areas where you want to consider in the planning stages. I've seen that many times people don't consider accessibility when it comes to budget or having enough resources, and they forget to include accessibility in the timeline because you'll need to schedule in accessibility reviews and testing. And it's important to schedule those reviews and testing throughout your project life cycle. And even before that, I've seen that people who work with agencies to help them with their projects, they sometimes forget to include accessibility requirements in proposals and contracts. And in doing so, that vendor that you're working with may turn in anything. And even though you may have verbally communicated that the project needs to be accessible, they may not have the information that they need to go on to make that accessible. So in your requests for proposals and your contracts, that's where you want to put that information. And you can also, in your contracts, require that people submit documentation and proof of accessibility so that there's an understanding that you'll be conducting due diligence to make sure that things are accessible. You should also work with your accessibility consultant to determine what standards you're going to use and what level of compliance you're going to achieve, because you can actually make something comply with accessibility standards, but still have access problems. There will be areas where people with disabilities still won't be able to use your project or your product or read your messaging or interact with it successfully. So you want to figure out, are you going for basic compliance, or are you going to work on creating a really usable project for people with disabilities? I've also noticed that people don't review their work with people with disabilities. They don't test it. So whether it's hardware, software, a website, an app, the written content, you always want to have a wide variety of people with disabilities to review that work. The other area where there's an opportunity to address things is in choosing your technologies that you're going to use in your project. You want to make sure that they support accessibility. You might choose a platform or a framework or a content management system, video players, audio players, anything like that. You want to make sure that whatever they output will support an accessible experience. Because if you get into the project building and you're using something that can't generate something accessible, you're going to have to do a lot of that duct tape work later on to fix those issues. When, if you chose something from the beginning to ensure that it will support accessibility, you'll have less problems, if any. The other thing that will help you as the PM is to document all the work that you're doing to support accessibility for your project. This is important for you as a person and for your organization, because you always want to prove that you've done your due diligence. And unfortunately, there are people whom some people call ADA trolls, and that means the Americans with Disabilities Act trolls, who actively go out and try to sue organizations over accessibility issues, not because they really want to see change, but because they're just causing chaos and problems. So you want to protect yourself and make sure that you have documentation that will support your work. Even if your project isn't perfect, you can at least show that you've tried in good faith to meet the standards and to make your work usable by everyone. So after PMs, let's talk about leadership. And actually, PMs getting support for accessibility from leadership. If you don't have leadership buy-in, it's going to be difficult when you are planning your project or arranging the budget. It will be difficult for you to move forward if you don't have that support, because you need to know that what you and your team will need to do to carry out the project, that management is going to be there to help you and support you when it comes to making your work accessible. The thing is, if you don't get their support and you haven't planned properly, management and leadership, they're not necessarily going to know what it takes to create an accessible experience. And the other thing is that they may actually tell you to do things that would hinder accessibility. So you want to make sure that you get their buy-in. The other thing is that you want to train your team in accessibility. There are organizations that have lots of turnover. So the people who are working on a project from year to year may change. And that's especially true if you work with outside agencies to do work. So you want to make sure that you're always keeping your team trained when it comes to accessibility and best practices and the latest tools and technologies. You want to make sure that people understand how to use them effectively. So let's move on to content managers and writers. And this is interesting because I would say this is a group of people who usually don't realize that they need to be involved in accessibility and in the process. So there are things that they can do to ensure that the end product is accessible. And it starts with the written content. You want to start writing the content before the designer even starts working on their part of the project. I've seen that people will try to create a design or architect a project, and then they think they can pour the content in to that framework or that design, or that system. But then they'll find that things don't quite look or flow the way that they should as far as the information. But if you start with the written content, then you'll find that you'll be thinking about the way the information flows and walking through the process and seeing things the way your audience would experience it. So you want to actually work with the designer to design that content that you've prepared. And I know that in these times we're using templates and pre-designed components, but it's important to make sure that you're choosing the proper component for whatever information that you're putting forth. Because you're going to be writing the content for every interface element. So work with the designers to do that. You'll also want to write using plain language principles. And plain language is just ensuring that your audience can read, understand, and engage with the content that you present the first time they read it. Because we know that people are in a rush, they're in a hurry, people are walking down the streets on their phones looking at things. And if they can't understand what you've put forth, then you're going to slow down progress or their progress. And they're going to have to spend more time reading and reading. And if people can't understand your information, the first thing they will do is click that X button and close out, because there's always someone else who has the same information out there, but you want them to get it from you. So use plain language so that people can interact with that content and use it successfully and quickly. You also want to test your content. Now, I told you that it's important to work with people with disabilities and test with them. It's important to do that when you're preparing your content too, because if it's not clear to them, you don't want to wait until later on in the project to have to rewrite things. It's easy if you start out with a small bit of content or an information flow and see if it makes sense to people. I know it's challenging now, particularly because of social distancing, but in usability, there's a thing called hallway testing. And you would be able to set up in a hallway somewhere, as the name suggests, or in a coffee shop, and stop people, ask them if they would participate in a 2-minute test. And it's helpful if you entice them with maybe a gift card and ask them how the content reads. Does it work for them? If they're able to understand and know what they should do with what you're presenting. And that's also a good time to work with your designers when they're putting forth their prototypes and you've put your content into the design, or they're designing your content. It's a good time to actually start testing that with people with disabilities and people without access needs even. So, as I mentioned, you do want to write with your designers because you'll be writing content for every UI element. And you want to make sure that your labeling is correct, your headings, your structure, that the layout works. So it's helpful when you work together with your designers to achieve that. And you can even focus on the micro content that may come later on. But if you can, work with your designers to ensure that it's accessible and clear. So let's talk about those designers. And when I'm talking about designers, I want to say that I'm talking about UX designers, interaction designers, UI designers, production, everybody involved in the interface and the structure and the design. I've observed that most accessibilities happen in the design phase, mostly because designers aren't using principles that would help ensure an accessible experience. So again, design that content. Work with them on the layout, the structure. If you're using a component or pattern library, as much as possible, you'll want to use those components that you have, but you also don't want to get stuck in a situation where the component doesn't work for you. Tweak the component if possible. And that's where designing that content comes in. I know it's a challenge because we're using libraries and frameworks to help us achieve consistency and to do things quickly. But just consider that you may need to tweak things a bit if possible. So there are many things a designer needs to consider when it comes to accessibility. It's the contrast, the heading structure, using sentence case text, the use of color, links and buttons, font size, and selecting the right font for readability. There are form considerations. And in the interest of time, I want to share a resource with you that will help you. There is a site called WebAIM, and they have a resource for designers to help you plan accessibility throughout your process. I'll have this link in the back of my deck in the resources, so be sure to check that out because there's so much to consider when it comes to planning for accessibility. And you want your planning to start just like with the PMs, you want to start with that planning at the beginning so that you've not created a wonderful, beautiful design that actually doesn't work. So it ends up being ineffective. The other thing you want to do is work with your engineers and developers and share your designs with them. Make sure that you lay them out and annotate those designs, because I've seen that people will give their designs to developers and they'll come back with something that's different. And that's been different than what they actually expected because they didn't explain what's supposed to happen with each element. They don't explain what's supposed to happen when there is a change in the state or any other conditions that may vary by how the user interacts with that content. So if you have those conversations, if you annotate your designs and share that with them, you'll find that there's less problems later on, if any. So let's move on to engineers and developers. And I have a special place in my heart for them because As I mentioned earlier, people usually think accessibility rests on their shoulders, that they are solely responsible for ensuring accessibility in a project. But they usually take up that work and do more than even they anticipated having to do for accessibility. Many of you all have sought to learn things that aren't even in your area of expertise because you have that responsibility for accessibility. But hopefully, if your team follows this process, you won't have to do things alone. So let's see a couple of things that you can do to ensure that your work is accessible. And again, the finer points, I will have resources in my slides so you can see more. If you're working on a website, an app, or a mobile app, there's the time to lean on HTML. HTML will get you there if you're using clean semantic code. Start there and make sure that your HTML is error-free. And it will also get you further than relying on things like ARIA, which is accessible rich internet applications. Because you only really want to use ARIA, this markup, when you have to. HTML is more powerful than people realize. So start there. One other area I want to point out is that developers have to ensure that whatever they produce supports people who use keyboards and other non-mouse devices. Because the thing is, not everybody is able to navigate with a mouse or even with their hands. They may use their voice to navigate. They may use their eyes to navigate. They actually may even use their mouth using a mouth stick. They may use their head with a head wand. So some people even use a limited portion of their hands. They may use a thumb mouse. So the thing is, you want to make sure that they're able to use your content. And it starts with supporting keyboard accessibility. Make sure that any part of your interface can be used and interacted with by keyboard. So let's talk about checklists. When it comes to accessibility, some people have been told that if they use a checklist and everything is done, then that means that their work is accessible. But I want to share that checklists are helpful for reminding you of what you need to do, but they're not really for ensuring that your work is accessible. So use them wisely so that you remember what you need to consider, but don't think that just because you've finished everything on your list that your work is actually accessible. The other thing you want to do is to test your work. You want to make sure that you're using an automated tool to help you, but you don't want to rely on the automated tool to ensure that everything is actually accessible. Because a tool can only find about 25% of the problems with accessibility. So test with a tool. Use something like Accessibility Insights from Microsoft. You can use Tenon, or you can use Axe by DQ. Those are good tools to get you started, but you'll also need to factor in manual reviews. So let's talk about the role of quality assurance when it comes to a project. There is so much that you can use out there when it comes to testing for accessibility and reviewing things. You want to make sure that you are not doing what I told the developers not to do, and that's to rely on a tool alone to check for accessibility. You want to test manually as well. And you also want to test using what's called assistive technologies. Those are pieces of hardware or software that enable people with disabilities to actually use information and interact with it. So as I mentioned, how people would navigate with non-mouse devices, perhaps with a head wand, a sip and puff switch, um, using their voice. These are all examples of assistive technologies. You don't have to test with them all, but you should test with a number of them and on different platforms to make sure that the project is accessible. And you want to test regularly, even after your project launches. Anytime there's an update, there's an opportunity for you to review the content to make sure that it's still working. Work with your accessibility consultant to help you do user research, because you want to make sure that people in your audience can actually use something and it's not just anecdotal testing. And when you're doing that, make sure that you're talking to people with a wide variety of disability types in that group. Lastly, let's get to leadership again. You want to make sure that you're supporting your team in their work and driving accessibility in all they do. You're setting the tone in your organization about accessibility. If people perceive that you don't care about it, then they generally won't make it a priority. So make sure that it has a priority in what you're doing. I mentioned lawsuits earlier, but there are other ways to motivate people to do things in an accessible way. Sometimes it just comes down to doing the right thing. And while you're at it, you want to consider in your organization, are your employees able to use the tools and the products that you have for them to do their work? Are they accessible? Because if they're not, then they may not be able to succeed in the challenges that they have in their everyday work. Not everyone who has a disability is open to speaking about it, and they're not all visible disabilities. There are hidden disabilities. So they may not speak up about it, but make sure the systems that you're using actually enable them to succeed in their work. All right. I think I flipped the slide a bit too quickly. Accessibility so extra. It's not really. It's not extra. The thing is, we're problem solvers, and design is solving problems. Engineering, you're solving problems. When you're planning, you're solving problems. You're making things clear when you're writing. It's all about building solutions that work for your messages and work for your audience. Some of us are used to doing much with little, and you'd be surprised at how having a little will support your ability to innovate and to come up with solutions that people never even considered. And because of that, it's important for you, whoever you are on a team, to be innovative and not follow what your competitors are doing. You want to be original. You are remarkable and you're doing remarkable things. You don't have to fall back to what everyone else is doing to create things, to fit in with the public. You want to inspire the public. So be inspired when it comes to building and creating things and solving those problems. Really, the time is now. We see that things are changing. We don't have solutions for all of the problems in the world today necessarily. We need to talk together about the problems, and it's critical that everyone can participate and have a voice at the table. And that happens through supporting diversity in your audience and inclusion in your audience. And one of my personal sayings is based on something a friend of mine taught me. She said that diversity is inviting me to the party. And I like to say that inclusion is asking me to dance while I'm there. So the time is now to ensure that everyone can get involved in what's going on today, can get involved with your messaging, can engage with you. Let's talk about real quickly, what would it be like if some of the Black people we know with disabilities weren't able to contribute their art? What would happen if Stevie Wonder and Alicia Keys weren't able to share their music? What would happen if they tried to use our content and it just didn't work for them? What would we do then? What about Harriet Tubman? She had a disability that people didn't understand back then, but we understand now. If she hadn't been able to support our forefathers and foremothers, where would we be? If she were living in our world today, would it work for her? Would she be able to achieve the same things that she achieved back then? How would that impact us? It's really all up to you. The power is in your hands. How will you empower people? Let's do this because we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela, for that. That was extremely insightful for me. And I will tell you this, as a program manager at Microsoft, yourself. There's so many things that you don't consider. And so I really appreciate you leveraging this platform to educate us all. And particularly, like I said, with me, there are ideas and thoughts that I have that I am going to definitely take back to my team and make sure that we start looking at things a little bit differently, even from a design perspective, as you mentioned. If we're designing things that are not accessible, then, what we're doing is creating even more problems, right? So we did have one question that I want to bring up really quickly, and this was around the metrics around accessibility and really understanding whether or not there are biases even within those. What are your thoughts on that?
There probably are biases, and it's hard to see them all, but I would say when it comes to disability, how I was talking about, we tend to focus on certain disability types. We don't even consider that people with different disabilities need to have a voice. We're usually focusing on a couple of things, but I'd like to take a fuller approach so that we're considering all disability types. So some disability types, I would even say, are quote unquote more acceptable. It usually comes down to the fact that people are uncomfortable when it comes to disability, whether it's talking about it or talking with someone. So,
Yes, absolutely agree. And just to bring up another point that I captured, you did provide some really good resources, and I think we're going to drop those in the chat. If they have not already been dropped, we'll share those, as well as in your slide deck. You mentioned that there's a different levels of compliance. There's like this basic level of compliance, and then there's the next step. In your opinion, where do you see us even reaching the basic level, or do you see that it's so much of a reach to even get to the basic level that altogether we're not even approaching that? Can you share some more insight on that specifically?
Sure. I think the issue is that when people learn that they have to do things accessibly, they're just given the standards, but no explanation for how to implement them properly. And again, they usually are told to rely on a checklist to help them meet those standards. But there's so much more to ensuring that the experience is accessible. And if they consider that compliance is sort of a baseline, there's sort of a process in implementing accessibility in your organization. So you may have to start with basic compliance. You may have to use that as a stepping stone before you're able to move to the best practices. Sometimes people are resisting change, and it's because you have to manage change in the organization, because this is doing things in a whole new way. It's not just, I can check this off. No, we have to think differently. We have to work together differently. So, yes, there is a challenge when it comes to implementing it, but if we recognize that it's a process and don't think that we have to do everything overnight, then it's helpful to put it in bite-sized pieces so that your team can rise up to that.
That's awesome. Awesome. Once again, just really, really want to thank you for participating today in this Juneteenth celebration. And you have inspired me, you've motivated me, and given me a lot of things to think about. I am looking forward to the comments and the feedback that we will have in the chat. And just thank you. Any final comments to our audience?
Thank you all. Thank you for being interested, and thank you for continuing to get messages out there of hope
Yes.
and unity.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. We will join back for the next session in about 4 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you.